Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Jack returned home earlier than usual. It had been a strange day. Something was wrong with his wife, Melissa. She was tense at breakfast, avoiding looking him in the eye, though she tried to give him the usual smile. There was a nervousness in her movements that Jack had learned to notice during their years of marriage. It was unusual because Melissa had always been a source of stability. She knew how to hide her emotions better than anyone else. When he closed the door behind him, there was a strange silence in the house. Usually Melissa hummed to herself as she cooked dinner, or the footsteps of children sounded somewhere upstairs. But tonight, nothing. It wasn't the kind of silence that was calm. Rather, it was tense like before a thunderstorm. Jack set his briefcase on the hall table and walked into the kitchen. There was a kettle of iced tea and an empty cup on the table. "Melissa?" he called out, expecting to hear her voice from the room or see her coming down the stairs. She appeared from the living room, wiping her hands with a towel. Her face was serious, but her gaze was strangely blank. She's usually so lively, gesticulating, speaking quickly and confidently. But now she was looking at him as if for the first time in 18 years she were seeing a complete stranger in front of her. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice was firm, but trembled at the end of the sentence. Jack frowned. The phrase sounded threatening. The man felt anxiety growing inside him. Options immediately flashed through his mind. Was she sick? Something with the children? Did something happen to her parents? He sat down at the table, trying to stay calm, though his heart beat faster. "Did something happen? You look like you just saw a ghost." He tried to make a joke to lighten the mood, but the joke didn't work. Melissa sat across from him, folding her arms in front of her. She didn't try to hide the tension. Her eyes studied him as if she were gauging how hard the next sentence would hit. "Jack, I need to tell you the truth. And I don't know how you're going to take it," she began. The words sounded slow, as if she was stalling for the inevitable. "You know that I've always wanted us to be okay. For the kids, for the family, for you. But I can't hold it in anymore." He stared at her in silence, tensely waiting for her to continue. The corners of her mouth trembled. "I want a divorce," she said at last. The world he'd thought was unshakable suddenly shook. It took him a few seconds to digest what he was hearing. "Divorce? Why? What did I do?" he asked, pushing back his chair and standing up. There was surprise and protest in his voice. "It's not about what you did or didn't do, Jack. It's me. It's always been me," she spoke calmly, but her eyes betrayed fear. "That's not an answer." "What do you mean it's me? We've been together for almost 20 years. We have 3 kids. How can it be just you?" Melissa raised her hand as if trying to stop his stream of questions. She turned away, avoiding his gaze. "I've been seeing another man for a long time ago, Jack." "It's Leonard," she breathed out. The name sounded like a punch in the face. Leonard wasn't just an acquaintance, he was a friend. They often met at barbecues, celebrated birthdays together, went on summer trips as a family. He had always seemed to Jack like an ordinary, even boring person who posed no threat to him. "Leonard?" He hadn't even realized how the sound had come off his lips. "Are you saying that you and he?" "Yes," she interrupted, not letting him finish. "It started years ago. I know that sounds awful." "How many years?" His voice was quiet, but full of hidden rage. He wasn't yelling, not yet. She leaned back in her chair, unable to bear his gaze. 16, she admitted at last. 16 years. The words hung in the air. He thought of the anniversaries they'd celebrated during that time, the birth of their twins, the shared happiness that had turned out to be an illusion. "Ethan and Dylan," he said suddenly. The words seemed to roll off his tongue. Melissa stared at him in silence. Her silence was the answer. Jack felt himself rising from the table. His hands trembled. He suddenly remembered the boys growing up, how he'd always thought they looked less like him than Emma. But he'd written it off to genes or fantasy. Now it all makes sense. "Are you saying I raised other people's children?" His voice trembled. "You're their father, Jack. You've been their father all these years," she tried to object. "But not their biological father," he interrupted. "And you've let me believe that all this time." Melissa looked away. The silence between them was becoming unbearable. "What now? You're going to Leonard?" He tried to keep his voice steady, but he could feel the anger inside him. "Yes. We've been planning it for a long time. His wife Laura had left, and now there was nothing to stop us being together. Her words were like a knife stabbing deeper and deeper. What about me? What am I supposed to do? He asked, taking a step back. You can stay in the house. I don't want to take anything. Just $500 a month for Emma until she turns 18. I'm taking Ethan and Dylan, she said, trying to look calm. Because they're not mine anyway, he added quietly, realizing he couldn't take her stare anymore. Jack silently walked out of the room, leaving her sitting at the table. Everything that he thought was his life had suddenly turned into chaos. He needed time to figure out how to move on with his life. Jack woke up in a cold sweat. The morning brought not relief, but a weight of reality that pressed down on his chest, preventing him from taking a deep breath. The events of last night reminded him of himself, like a broken record jangling on a single chord, 16 years old. They're not your children. He got out of bed, pulled on a t-shirt, and walked out into the living room. The house seemed empty and foreign, despite the familiar walls and smells. Melissa's jacket lay in a chair on the corner, and a pair of her boots stood nearby, reminders that she'd been his wife just yesterday. But now it seemed like a set from a play Jack was no longer starring in. On the kitchen table was a sheet of paper with her neat handwriting. I'll pick up the boys this afternoon. Thanks for everything. You're a good man, Jack, but I want to be happy. He crumpled the note without finishing it. He arrived at work an hour early, as if he was doing it out of habit. His office was in the far corner of the office, away from the hustle and bustle and people. Opening the door, he threw his briefcase on the desk, sat down, and closed his eyes. His partner, Steve, walked in a few minutes later. You look like you've been run over by a truck, he said, sitting down across from him. A truck? More like a steamroller, Jack mumbled without opening his eyes. Tell me. Jack told him everything. No details, no attempts to defend himself. Just the facts. Steve remained silent, nodding occasionally. When Jack finished, his friend stood up and poured 2 glasses of coffee. What now? He asked, holding out one of the glasses to Jack. Work. All I have is work, Jack replied, taking a big sip. Then let's get on with this server, Steve said, clapping him on the shoulder. These words were the beginning of a new chapter in Jack's life. A few days later, Jack was fully immersed in the project. The server system they were developing was complex and required a lot of tweaking, but it was a lifesaver for him. Every minute he focused on the codes, wires, and schematics as if they could mend a crack in his life. One evening, as he and Steve worked late into the night, a phone call rang in the office. Jack picked up the phone, expecting to hear the voice of one of the contractors, but instead it was his daughter, Emma, on the other end. Hi, Dad. Are you still at work? Her voice was quiet and a little strained. Yeah, baby. Is something wrong? Can I stay with you this weekend? Sure. You always can. Is it something with Mom? Emma's confused. No, it's just, I don't want to be there. With the boys and, this Leonard guy. Okay, he said, feeling a strange sense of joy rise up inside. Emma wanted to be with him, not them. When the weekend came, Jack and Emma had their ritual. They ordered pizza, watched old movies, and ate ice cream straight out of the carton. She told him about school, about how she was preparing for university. She was smart and ambitious, not at all like her brothers. But for all the talking, Jack couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. Emma spoke too calmly, too measuredly, as if she were trying to distract him from something important. There's a reason you wanted to stay with me, isn't there? He asked between movies. She lowered her eyes. I know about Mom and Leonard, she said finally. The words came out of nowhere. Ow! Mom told me years ago. My brothers know too. They think it's funny, but I didn't know how to tell you. And you didn't say anything the whole time? I didn't want to hurt you, Dad. You were happy. And I wanted you to stay that way. Jack didn't know what to say. He just squeezed her hand tighter and nodded. Several months passed. The system they were working on was almost complete. Jack and Steve were preparing a presentation for a potential client that could be their first major contract. It was a watershed moment that could change everything. That evening, after a long day at work, Jack came home and for the first time in a long time felt like the house belonged to him again. He opened the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of beer, and sat down on the couch. His phone vibrated and a message from Emma popped up on the screen. Dad, Thanks for the weekend. I love you. He smiled as he looked at the screen. Life wasn't over. It was just beginning. The morning began with the crackle of the coffee machine. Jack, standing in the kitchen, was angry. The damn machine had burned through the filter, and now the hot slop was dripping onto the table. He reached for a rag, but it wasn't there. His hand slid across the empty surface. Quagmire, not morning, he muttered to himself, glancing at his watch. It was 7 in the morning, which meant that in an hour Steve would already be calling with plans for the day. All the while, Jack tried to stay focused. It had been months since Melissa had left, but the feeling of a vacuum still pressed. The workflow had become an escape, but last night had been especially hard. Emma, his oldest daughter, had sent pictures of the boys spending time with Leonard. The pictures showed Leonard laughing while placing his hand on the shoulder of one of the twins. It all seemed too normal, like he was the kind of father Jack had tried to be all these years. It hit him deeper than he wanted to admit. Jack blotted his coffee and, leaving the mess on the table, threw on his jacket. He and Steve had left the server prototype in the office yesterday. It was a key point in their project. Today they were to show the system to a representative of the Department of Transportation. With any luck, might be their first major client. Jack parked outside the company building and went upstairs. Steve was already there. He was standing at the window, holding a cell phone. There was something between amazement and fury on his face. Had something happened? Jack felt anxiety run up his spine. "We're screwed," Steve replied, slamming the phone down and turning toward him. The department had a new proposal. Some new contractor just last night. They want to postpone our meeting. What? Jack stepped closer. Who's the contractor? I don't know yet. But if they go in first, we lose everything. Jack clenched his fists, feeling a wave of rage building. He'd spent months on this project. This was his opportunity to prove to everyone, especially himself, that he was capable of more. "Okay," he said, exhaling. "We're going anyway. Let them try to refuse," looking us in the eye. An hour later, they were standing in the department's reception area. The lobby was brightly lit, the smell of fresh paint in the air. Behind the glass wall, you could see the offices of the employees, where work was in full swing. A man in an expensive suit sat near the reception desk, his face unfamiliar. But Jack noticed the man cast a quick glance in their direction. "That's our new competitor," Steve said quietly, shaking his head in the man's direction. Jack walked up to the front desk and said in a confident voice, "Jack Turner, we had an appointment for 10 in the morning." The girl at the front desk looked confused. "I'll check with Mr. Logan. Please wait." She picked up the phone, but before she could finish speaking, the door next to her desk opened. "Turner, are you here already?" A middle-aged man with a sharp jawline and a look that looked as if he were assessing on the move peered out from behind the door. "Let's go." Jack felt a rush of relief. Steve clapped him on the shoulder. "How did you manage that?" "I don't know, but we have to give our best shot," Jack said as he walked inside the office. The meeting lasted an hour. They showed the system, explained how it worked, and, most importantly, how it could save thousands of dollars. Jack spoke confidently, feeling that he had captured the audience's interest. But at one point, he noticed Mr. Logan glancing at his watch. When they were done, Logan nodded, thanked them for their time, and said they would need to discuss the proposal with their colleagues. On the way out of the office, Jack could feel the tension. "They're interested, but not 100%, he told Steve as they walked to the car. "Maybe, but we've given them the best we can," Steve replied. When they reached the office, Jack's cell phone rang. He picked it up, and Logan's voice said, "Mr. Turner, we're impressed with your system, but there's one thing." Jack felt his heart go into a frenzy. "What was it?" he asked. "Your competitors offered a similar system at a lower cost, but they don't have your expertise. We want to contract with you, but you'll have to lower the price." Jack squeezed the phone. "We're willing to discuss." 2 weeks later, the contract was signed. It was their first major success, and it meant Jack would never be the same again. Jack stood in front of the large window of his new office, his gaze fixed on the city that lay beneath him like an unknowable spider web. The glass walls, the air that smelled of the cleanliness and freshness of a new beginning. It all brought with it the illusion that he was at the center of his own universe. He felt on top of the world. He had just signed a contract with the Department of Transportation. Their company was preparing for massive growth. But despite this success, something was burning inside him. Steve, his old partner, burst into the office, his face focused, as if something had descended upon them without asking permission. "Did you see that?" His voice was dry, almost angry. Jack pulled away from the window and turned to his friend. Steve's face reflected some anxiety, something dark that didn't bode well. "What's wrong?" Steve tossed a newspaper on the table, and Jack picked it up with a frown. The headline was stunning. "Carpet Empire Collapses. Langford King has lost everything." "I just talked to people in town," Steve continued, watching Jack's reaction. "It's not just a rumor. Langford and his company are already in the process of bankruptcy. It looks like his personal life and business have gone down the drain." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He picked up the paper, unable to take his eyes off the words. Langford was the same man who seemed to be on a pedestal, and now his fall was inevitable, like a tornado hurtling toward a quiet town. "It's the fallout from his business decisions," Steve said, looking at his friend. "Rumor has it that his divorce from Joyce was the final straw, not just in his personal life, but in his business life as well." Jack couldn't believe it. Langford, who had always seemed so confident, wealthy, and successful, now found himself in the midst of scandal. His wife was gone, and with her went her capital, her support. Jack had seen Linford lead their company to the top. Now it had all collapsed, not just because of the divorce, but because of his unprofessional decisions. But what surprised Jack most was that this moment hadn't come at all by accident. Everything was turning over in his mind. He knew that Langford had always been overconfident and careless. But it was now, at the moment of his fall, that Jack felt that fate had played a cruel trick on him. He himself had watched Langford's own relationships break down, his morals crumble. What was it now? What was the difference between them? "Did I owe him anything?" he asked, rising from his chair. "I don't feel anything, Steve. It's not mine after all." Steve shrugged his shoulders. "But you're still part of it. You were part of his downfall, even if not directly." At that moment, Jack felt as if someone had stabbed him directly in the soul with an invisible knife. This wasn't revenge in the usual sense. Everything that was happening around him appeared truly chaotic and messy. A few days later, Jack decided to meet Langford in person. His old rival now sat in a small corner cafe, completely lost, almost lifeless. He was nothing like the confident man with whom Jack had once shared successes and failures. Langford sat with his mug of coffee and stared out the window as if he didn't know what to do next. Jack sat across from him, making no attempt to hide his surprise. "I see you're as good as ever at being on the down low," Jack said with an icy calmness, putting his hands on the table. Langford looked at him with weariness in his eyes. His face was wrinkled, as if he hadn't slept in days on end. He looked older than he really was. "You don't understand, Jack," Langford said quietly. "Everything has collapsed. I can't even look at my daughter, let alone—" He stopped, exhaling heavily. "I've already lost everything, you know? And it's not just business. It's everything. I've lost everything." Jack felt a strange combination of sympathy and satisfaction. He was ready to walk away, but at some point he just couldn't. "Didn't you think about the consequences? How could you do that to Joyce, to her daughters, to the children?" Langford looked at him with despair, but there was a kind of sullen fire in his eyes. She left with the money. That was her plan. You know, she took what she could. I was blind, Jack, but Jack grinned. "You never thought that when everything fell apart, you'd be left empty-handed. Not just because you were in love with her, but because you always relied on other people's strength instead of your own. And now here you are, alone." The seconds stretched like an eternity. Langford tried to find the words, but he couldn't. He knew Jack was right. Everything was ruined, not just in business, but in his life. He had lost everything. Jack stood up. He knew this meeting wasn't about feeling sorry for Langford. It was the end of a story that could no longer go on. It was the end. "You destroyed it all yourself, Langford. You destroyed everything yourself." Jack turned and walked out of the cafe without looking back. He knew that now that Langford was disappearing from the horizon, he could move on. But he couldn't forget how his life had intersected with this series of mistakes, disappointments, and downfalls. All that was left was to go forward. Jack entered Foster Carter's spacious mansion with a slight sense of discomfort. He wasn't used to places like this. Everything here was too luxurious, too impeccable. The marble floor gleamed in a way that reflected every detail. The huge windows that overlooked the ocean, the paintings on the walls, each one more expensive than his house. "You're too tense, Turner." Foster's gruff voice came from across the room. He was sitting in his motorized wheelchair by the window, sipping something amber from a crystal glass. "I'm not relaxed enough for a house like this," Jack parried, tossing his jacket over the back of his chair. Foster laughed. His laugh was thick and infectious, though it had the tiredness of an older man who'd seen too much. "You don't just relax. You be yourself. You're a guest here, not someone who has to prove something." Jack sat down across from him, feeling his own tension slowly recede. But it didn't last long. A woman entered the room, slender but with a strong posture. She moved with a grace that was hard to miss. Her skin was a warm olive color, and her long hair fell in dark waves over her shoulders. "This is Maya," Foster said, keeping his eyes on Jack. "My right hand." Maya looked at Jack with mild interest. Her brown eyes studied him, and Jack felt as if they were penetrating deeper than he would have liked. "It's a pleasure," she said dryly and nodded. Then she shifted her gaze to Foster. "I just checked the reports. Everything's in order." "Thank you, Maya. But you're resting today. Make sure Turner makes himself at home here." Maya looked at Jack with a measure of derision. "Looks like I'm not the best hostess to handle this." Jack smiled. There was no anger in her voice, just a touch of sarcasm that made him feel a little more confident. In the evening, the three of them sat on the veranda, watching the sun sink below the horizon, coloring the ocean shades of red and gold. Foster drank whiskey and told stories from his turbulent past. Maya laughed, and Jack listened, trying not to miss a word. He liked this place, liked the atmosphere, but most of all, he liked Maya. He couldn't help but notice the way her dark eyes sparkled when she laughed, the way she lightly touched the bracelet on her wrist when she thought. They were little things, but they were mesmerizing. "Maya, show him the beach," Foster said, waving his hand. "It's so beautiful here in the evening that even you, Turner, will stop being so glum." Maya reluctantly stood up, taking a thin scarf to throw over her shoulders. "Come on." She tossed it over her shoulder, clearly not thrilled with the idea. Jack followed her. The sand was warm under his feet, and the waves lapped gently against the shore. They walked in silence, listening to the sound of the water and smelling the salty odor of the ocean. "How long have you worked for Foster?" Jack finally asked, breaking the silence. "For years," Maya answered without turning her head. "And you? How long have you known him?" "Just a couple months." "He's a unusual person." She grinned. "That's putting it mildly. But he's honest and generous. There aren't many like him." Jack nodded. They stopped, and Maya turned to him, her gaze deep and penetrating again. "You're not like the people who come here. Most people who get around him have a look in their eyes like they're waiting for something to be given to them. You have a different look." "What's that?" "Like you're trying to figure out if you should stay or run." Jack laughed. "You're very observant. It's part of my job." There was her sarcasm again. Jack felt that this conversation had become more than just a formality for him. The next morning, Maya knocked on the door of his room. "Foster's waiting for you at breakfast," she said briefly, but her gaze lingered a second longer than necessary. When Jack entered the kitchen, Foster was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. "Have you seen how beautiful it is here at night?" he asked. "I have," Jack answered, not thinking about the beach. Foster grinned. "Then stay longer. You haven't realized what's so interesting about this place yet." He didn't specify what it was, but Jack began to suspect that the old man was much more perceptive than he seemed at first glance. Jack stood on the balcony of the Foster mansion, looking out over the dark ocean. The wind was warm, but with a slight salty chill. He inhaled deeply, trying to feel the tranquility that seemed to always hover in this place. His mind, however, was electrified, his thoughts restless. The night was unsettling, as if it foreshadowed something important. Soft footsteps were heard behind him. He turned around and saw Maya. She was wearing a thin, light-colored robe, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Her eyes shone in the dim light, reflecting off the water. "You're awake," she said, leaning against the railing beside him. "Too much on my mind." Jack tried to smile, but it was unconvincing. "Foster?" Jack nodded. The old man's condition was getting worse every day. Despite his fortitude and sarcasm, Foster was having trouble getting out of bed. Maya didn't say it out loud, but they both knew time was running out. "He wants to discuss his will with you tomorrow," she said, looking out at the ocean. "I know, but it's not something I want to think about." She looked at him, her gaze both warm and penetrating. "You're not the type to run from problems, Jack. You've dealt with it all up until now. Why is it different now?" Jack was about to answer, but suddenly his phone rang. He pulled it out of his pocket, saw Emma's name on the screen, and answered it immediately. "Hey, babe, everything okay?" Her voice was excited, the words coming out too fast. "Dad, you're not going to believe this. I got an offer to stay in Barcelona permanently. They wanted to work in their research group." "That's incredible, Dad." Jack smiled. Her joy was infectious. "That's amazing, Emma. I'm so proud of you. You definitely deserve this. I knew you'd understand." Her voice was full of happiness. "I so wanted to tell you first." The conversation ended, and Jack tucked his phone into his pocket. He looked at Maya again, and she smiled. "It's good that you have her. You always glow when you talk to her." Jack nodded, feeling the warmth those words brought. The next morning, Foster insisted on getting out of bed and having breakfast with them. He was pale, but his voice still sounded firm. He sat at the table, looking around at Maya and Jack. "Come on," he said, slamming the table. "Stop beating around the bush. I have serious things to discuss while I'm still here." Jack and Maya looked at each other, but said nothing. Foster continued. "The will has already been signed, but I want you to know, Jack. The house is going to Maya. I want her to stay here to keep this place alive. And the business, it's going to Joyce and her girls. They deserve a chance to make things right." Jack felt something warm and heavy pierce his chest. It was both unexpected and right. Foster had always been a man who knew how to make decisions. "Thank you," Jack said, feeling that words didn't seem enough. "And to you, Jack," Foster added, "I leave something more valuable." Jack frowned. Foster gestured him closer and held out an envelope. "Open it later, when you feel ready." That evening, when Maya was already asleep, Jack sat on the veranda with the envelope in his hands. He opened it slowly, expecting to see legal papers or something formal. But inside was only a short note. "Sometimes we don't choose the house, Jack. The house chooses us. Take care of her." He knew what Foster was talking about. Maya was the person who had become his new foundation. Now all that was left was not to let go of this new life. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.